In this chapter, we're going to look at a few more basic user interface components that come with Telerik UI. We've handled buttons in the last chapter, so now we'll see how to add different kinds of inputs to our forms, including sliders, drop-downs, and text areas. We'll also convert our detailed page interface to use a tab layout, and we'll complete the dashboard filtering requirement by adding a combo box for assignee selection. Just like we did in the last chapter, we're going to be referring to the documentation on the Telerik website, so make sure you have that open and handy because we're going to be doing some exercises as well. In this lesson, we'll be working on the add item form since it has only a few simple inputs we can transform into Telerik UI inputs. Right now we're on the dashboard form. This is where we were working and adding these buttons. Let's head over to backlog and then the add button. This is the add new item form and it's using the create view. We're going to be converting these plain inputs into Telerik UI inputs. Now before you watch me show you how to do it here, I'll invite you now to pause the video and try to convert the form inputs to Telerik UI inputs. Go ahead and try it yourself. All right, did you try that? Let's do it together now. So this is a plain HTML input. I'm going to open up Developer Tools in Chrome here so we can take a look at that. All right, there's the input. It's using some Bootstrap styling as you can see here. Let's head over to the code and in the Views folder, open up the backlog folder and open up the create CS.html file. So here is the form and we're using all the typical ASP.NET MVC conventions here like begin form, anti-forgery token, and the validation summary. We're not going to be worried about that since we're focused on Telerik UI here. So here is our first form group, which has a label for the title of the item and the editor for the title of the item. We're going to leave the label alone, and we're also going to leave the validation message for alone. Instead of this editor for, this is where we're going to use our Telerik input. So I'm going to make a little space here, but I'm going to keep the editor for here for now while we're still working on this. We're going to use HTML and we're going to use the Kendo helper, just like we did in the previous chapter. This time we're going to need to find the appropriate component for us to use. Now I do recommend that you use the documentation. If you're just starting out with this will get you used to the idea of using docs alongside with your coding, and you might learn something new even if you've used this before. So head over to docs and then select documentation, and under the components section you'll find the editors section, and if you scroll down here you'll find the text box section. Click on overview and you'll find some examples of how the text box is implemented. You could use the standard text box helper, but I'm going to show you a different way that you can implement this that's a little bit more suited for our needs, and it has a little bit less configuration due to the way we've set up our model. So back in the code, our Kendo extension will list the available components. You'll find text box and text box for. Now, you're going to be using text box for here, and the reason for that is because we have a model that we're binding to, and we want the Razor view to automatically render the name for this text input because we're using a form. It must have a name, so on postback, the value for that input will be posted to the correct property. You could use text box here, then you'd need to manually select the name and configure a lot of other manual properties that you don't have to if you're using text box for. So basically, the same rules apply as you would normally use for ASP.NET MVC. For text box for, we need to provide the lambda expression that will point us to the property of the model that we want to use. So we're just going to use the exact same thing we did here with the editor for. I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And just by doing that, without even using the name, I can refresh here and we get our Telerik UI input right here. Remember, because we're using text box for, the name is going to be automatically populated here. There it is in the code. You can see that it automatically gets a class of k-textbox, which is a Kendo class that comes defined with the CSS that we've already added to our layouts. This is the theme that's making it have that look. Also, notice that we have the name, the ID, the data validation required attribute, which is automatically hooked up for us to the validator here. Now, if we want this to stretch all the way across, there are two options for that. One is we can add the width attribute to 100%, or I can just add the form control class that's coming from Bootstrap, since we're keeping Bootstrap around, and the form control class automatically will stretch that text box. For this case, I'm going to add the form control class. The way I would do that is using the Fluent API. So I would use HTML attributes,
and I provide a new object. I can just copy this add class right here, and I can delete this editor for now. Let's save that and take a look. Great. So there's our text box. This is a Kendo style text box. You can see it behaves like a Kendo text box, and this will inherit any theme that we apply at the top level. Let's see if the postback works. I'm going to say new item 2, and I'm going to click add, and there's our new item 2 in the list of items. Let's go back to the add form. There is this text area for the description, and there's also the type here. Go ahead and try adding the text area yourself. And also, once you're done with that, as another exercise, you can use the drop-down list that comes with Telerik UI instead of this regular HTML select. Go ahead and try that as well. Pause the video and you can try those two inputs. I'm going to go ahead and continue with this description one right here. So let's head over to the code. And here's the description field. It's a text area 4. Now I'm going to do a little shortcut here, and I'm just going to cheat. Instead of typing this whole line again, I will just insert Kendo, a Kendo extension method, and then dot. If we take a look at what's available here, you will see that text area 4 is one of the items on the list as well. Now, the only difference between text area 4 that comes with MVC and the Kendo one is that we don't have a second parameter here for the class name. So I am going to remove that and add our HTML attributes the same way I did here. In fact, I'm just going to copy this one and paste it on here. And just as simple as that, we can run this and we'll see that we get a text area for the description field with the Kendo UI styling applied. Go ahead and try converting this select to a drop-down list. In the next lesson, we're going to continue with that, but we're going to continue on a details form, which has a few of its own drop-downs. And you can view that by clicking one of these items. There's the details form that we're going to be converting to Telerik components. Hopefully you had a chance to try to convert the rest of the drop-downs on the details form to Kendo drop-downs. And this is what I've done. So now all my drop-downs are Kendo drop-downs: type, status, priority, and assignee. If we take a look at the code, you'll see that I pretty much copied and pasted the Kendo drop-down list helper and just changed the property names to statuses, priorities, and users. So that's not very difficult, but we also want to use templates here now to style these a little bit differently. So here's our finished application. You can see that our type has little icons and our status remains just text. So that's fine. We can leave that one alone. And priority has these nice little bootstrap type badges and the associated classes. All right, so let's add some template flavor here. I'm going to open up the Kendo documentation. And this is the Kendo UI for jQuery documentation that describes the special templating language that we're going to be using. That sounds a lot scarier than it is, actually. All we do is just render templates as HTML, but where we want to replace values, we use hash equals and then the variable name, and then we close it with a closing hash. So that's a simple explanation of how we do template replacement with Kendo templates. You can read more about Kendo templates in this document right here at this URL. Let's head over to the code. And the first template we want to provide is this item type dropdown. So I'm going to use the template extension here. And here I need to provide a string that's going to be the HTML. Now, if I provide just anything in here, like hello, you'll see that now every single value is just hello. So our template is being rendered, and this is what it looks like. It looks like text. Of course, a template takes in HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and utilize the templating syntax here. And I'm going to add a span, and I'm going to use hash colon, and then data dot text, and I'm going to close the hash right there. So everything in between hash colon and hash is going to be interpreted with data being the actual data item that we're iterating over. So if we're binding to item types, then each item type that we're iterating over here is going to be the data property. Let's take a look at that. What is item types here? If I hover my mouse over item types, you'll see that it's an IEnumerable of select list item. Select list item comes with MVC. I'm going to F12 into that, and let's F12 into select list item. You'll see that this has text as a string, it has a value as a string, and a few other properties. That's why in my template, I'm choosing the text property of data because I want to show the text and not the value. So I'm going to save this and let's take a look. All right, that refreshed, and now we're back to where we started. We just have spans in here, but we're showing the correct values. So I need to show the images as well as the text. And I already have these images stored in my solution. If we take a look at content, images, and there they are. I have icon bug, icon chore, icon impediment, and icon PBI. Notice that it's icon underscore and then the name that we're using, which is just a happy coincidence, so I don't need to do any extra conversion. I can just refer to these images right in line here. Let's do that. I'm going to create another string, and this is going to have my image tag, and I'm going to provide the source. Now I need to build up the URL of the content, which is going to point to my image. So here I'm going to use the content helper, and this is going to go to the content folder, images, icon underscore, and here we need to have bug, chore, impediment, or PBI, which is actually the text of our data. So I'm going to use my template replacement here, hash colon data dot text, then close the hash, and then dot png. Then I'm going to concatenate that with a closing tag. And let's concatenate that with a span as well. Let's take a look. Okay, so under types, whoa, I have a really huge set of icons here, don't I? But as you can see, the Kendo UI dropdown list is going to support whatever you throw at it. So we have the giant icons, which we need to control. And we also have the spans here right to the right. So let's fix up those icons. For each of the icons, I actually have a special class. It's a CSS class, backlog icon. I'm going to specify that here. And there we go. All right, now that you know how to do templates with Kendo UI dropdowns, I welcome you to try creating this priority template with this special bootstrap badge styling. Did you try it? All right, let's do this together. I'm going to find the dropdown for the priorities right here, and I'm going to specify the template, and I'm going to specify it as a span. Inside the span, we're going to have our data text, and the span is going to have a special class that's coming from Bootstrap. So we're using the badge class. That's already going to give it some styling, but I also added a few of my own priority-based classes. So for each different priority, it's going to have priority dash, and then we're going to use a replacement here, data.text. I'm going to show you something else here. This is not going to work right out of the box, but we'll fix it in a second. Let's take a look at this. You'll see that the badge class is being applied, giving us the small bold letters here for each of the values in the dropdown, but our colors are not being applied, even though in our content, in the site.css file, I have these priority classes defined. Priority critical is a certain color, priority high, priority medium, and priority low. So because our enums for the priority are actually capitalized, it's not matching up with the lowercase class name that we've defined here. So what you can do with Kendo templates, and this is pretty cool, you can actually run JavaScript functions right on them. So data.text is a string, and we can run two lowercase on the string, and this will be interpreted in JavaScript, and it'll be converted to lowercase. Be careful with that because you want to make sure that text is actually not null before you run two lowercase on it. Now, when we take a look at the dropdown, you'll see that our priority values in the dropdown have the priority color class, and that's looking pretty good. Next, let's take care of this estimate slider. On our details form, we want to have a slider that looks like this. This is an enhanced version of the HTML slider. It has handles that allow us to move left to right. It has labels underneath, and it's much nicer looking, inheriting the theme that we're going to have with Kendo UI. Here's our current slider. It's just a regular HTML slider. Let's take a look at the code. Now, what we're using to render that slider is just an editor for that comes with MVC, and we're specifying that input to be of type range, which allows us to specify the step, the minimum value, and the maximum value. But instead of having just a simple input, what we can do is use the Kendo helper to render us a slider. And we're going to use slider 4 here because we're in the form, and we're going to target the estimate, which is a number. When we're using the slider, let's go ahead and use parentheses here. We're able to tap into max. We'll set that to 20. We can set the min to be 1. Actually, let's set the min to be 0. We can also set the large step and the small step. In our case, the step is equivalent to large step. We'll set that to 1. What that means is the gradations will be listed from 1 to 20 underneath the slider. And I can go ahead and remove the editor 4 down here. Let's take a look at the result. All right, that's how simple it is to get a slider. Now you can see the numbers are riding on top of each other here. We can change that by changing the step Let's say we have the large step set to 5. And instead of marking from 0 to 20 at every single step, now we have 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20 marked off. But I also want this slider to stretch the full width of the form just like all the other controls. So we're going to use our handy HTML attributes here to do that. And just like before, I'm going to set the width to be 100%. I'm going to set the large step back to 1 because now we have enough width so the numbers are not riding on top of each other. And there we go. There's our slider. If I set this to 18 and save the form, you can see that this stays on 18. One of our new requirements for RPS Project Tracker version 2 is to create a tabbed interface on the details page. Here is the completed application, and here are the tabs to switch between the different forms. We have the details form, the tasks form, and the chit-chat form. The application as it is right now just has buttons to switch between these. When a button is tapped, a new action on the backlog controller is called, and that view that's related to that action is rendered. So we're going to use the TabStrip widget that comes with Telerik UI. Here's an example of the TabStrip. You can find it at this demo's URL right here. And here's a simple setup for the TabStrip. This one switches between weather in different cities. Now the difference between the TabStrip, the way we're going to implement it, and the way we currently have our pages implemented is that the TabStrip is going to dynamically load the content from an action on the controller. So we're going to need to edit our controller a little bit and create new actions for the forms that we're going to be loading to display the different views. Let's head over to our code. Here's the backlog controller that we're going to be working with. The root page that's loaded is the details view. Let's take a look at that. Here's backlog, and here's the details view. And as you can see, here are the buttons that switch between views. All they do is just navigate to a different action. And down at the bottom, we have a switch statement, and we render a partial view based on whatever action was selected. We save the currently requested screen in the view bag, and if the screen is details, we display the partial details. Notice the underscore here, these are the partials. If the screen is tasks, then we display tasks. And if the screen is chit-chat, then we display chit-chat. Instead of displaying them here like this, we're going to be using the TabStrip. So I'm going to select this switch statement. I'm not going to delete it just yet because we might need to reference the code inside. So I'm going to just comment this out. I'm also going to go up here and comment out our 3 buttons. And now, right over here, I'm going to go ahead and create the TabStrip. We're going to be using the Kendo HTML helper again, and I'm going to call TabStrip on this. Now, because this is a standalone widget, we need to give it a name. Let's go with simply TabStrip here. And now we need to use the items to be able to configure each of the tabs. Here's that configurator pattern that I've talked to you about before. Telerik UI uses this pattern quite a bit in configuring some of the widgets. So we're going to get past the TabStrip, and then we're going to do some things with it. Notice I'm going to need multiple lines here, so I'm going to add a paren here and a closing paren. I might as well split this up to multiple lines here so we can see things easier. And now on my TabStrip in the Lambda, I can add a new tab. So this will add a tab. I need to give it a text. So let's start with details. This will be our first tab. I'm going to save this and let's take a look at what we have so far. I'm going to go here to Chrome and reload the details page. And there we go. We have a tab strip here and we have the details tab. When I tap on it, the details tab opens, but there's no content in it just yet. I can follow the same pattern here and add another tab. Let's call it tasks. And each tab can have content. So this is not how we're going to be loading content. This is if you have static content. So for example, let's say I have an H1 here. And on my tasks tab, let's say I just have text here. So here's an example of how you can add content to the different tabs. And this is the simple approach. Ours needs to be a little bit more advanced. Okay, so here we are. Notice that no tab is selected by default. We're going to do that manually later on. And we're going to do that based on the URL. I'm going to select details. And here's our H1 with hello details. If I select tasks, we have tasks. And there's a slight animation that happens when you select a tab. That's the default animation. It slides down. You can control that. And the documentation on animations is available right here. So that's the basic tab strip. Let's continue with loading our content in the next lesson. There's multiple ways of providing content to your tabs. The way I just showed you in the previous lesson uses static content. However, in our application, we have forms that are located in different partial views. So for example, here's the details partial view. This has a form, and this fills in the details for each PT item. We also have a separate tasks form right here to create a new task. And we have a chit chat form. When we navigated using the switch statement, each form got rendered on a postback, and that's fine. But when we're using the TabStrip, we need to have the ability to load these forms dynamically. So each one of these tabs that we added can load content from a different action on our controller. Let's do that. Instead of this content here, which is static, we're going to call load content from. And now we need to provide a couple things here. We're going to use this override right here, which is going to take in an action name, a controller name, and then the route values. We're going to create a new action called details form. And this is going to be on the backlog controller. And we need to pass in the ID. So this is the ID of the item that we're showing. And that's on the model. If I go back up here, remember this model right here is a PT item on the details form. All right, so let's handle the details form right now on the backlog controller. Now, in order to edit the code, I'm going to need to stop the project. And here is our backlog controller. This is the action that gets called in this route when we first load the details page. And that's fine. We're going to leave that one alone. This right here gets called when we actually post the data back with our edits, when we save the form. We're no longer going to be able to do that because inside the TabStrip, inside a tab, we're going to have a dynamically loaded form that needs to have its own route for the postback. So instead of posting back to details, I'm going to be posting back to details form. We'll come back to this in a second. First, we need to load the details form. So that's going to be a public action result, details form, and that's going to take in the ID of the item. Let's go ahead and give this route right here. I'm just going to copy this one and paste it here. So first we need to get the item, and I'm going to copy this line right here. And we're also going to need to get the users because the details form requires users. So let's copy this. I'm going to paste this right here. And now we need to create the model for the details form. So that's var model equals new PT item details VM. We're going to pass in the item and we're going to pass in the users. And then we'll return partial view. The partial view that we're going to return is going to be underscore details, and we'll pass in the model. Users is not happy because here users is IEnumerable and this model requires a list. So we need to call toList on this. So let's take a look at details partial view, and you can see that at the top, we're declaring the model to be PT item details VM. Partial view is going to be loaded separately as a child, and that's why we're returning partial view here. This action is going to be called separately by the TabStrip. And then in that form, when we hit the save button, it's going to call this post action, and it's going to save our item. Now we need to make a change here because this is going to be a little different. We're no longer going to be returning the view for the details here because we're already in the view. We're just posting back from a form that was loaded dynamically. So here we need to do a redirect. I'm going to comment out what we're doing here. And instead, we're going to return redirect to action, details, and we'll pass in the ID. And in case we have an error, let's do the exact same thing. You'd probably have better error handling in your own applications. This is just for demo purposes here. So I'm going to save everything and let's kick this off. And here we are. I'm going to go to backlog, go into one of the items, and there is our TabStrip. I'm going to click on details and our details form is loaded. Now, just so that you know exactly what is happening and when, I'm going to go in here and put some breakpoints in here. Here's the details action. I'm going to put a breakpoint right there. Here's the details form. This is the partial view that gets loaded dynamically by the TabStrip. And here's the details form postback. I'm going to put a breakpoint there. Let's go ahead to our project and I'm going to reload this. Notice our details action gets called. This is the initial load. And we return the view with the details and the item as the model. That's it. Nothing happens until we hit this details button, the tab, and that'll load our details form dynamically. So that makes a call to the details form action and it returns just the partial view to be loaded into that tab. There we go. If I make a change here, let's change that to a bug and change the name, and I'm going to hit save. Then only our details form gets posted back with that particular model right there. Once it gets saved right here with the updated item, we redirect to the details action. And here we are back in the details action. So the whole page reloads and we start again. And there's our update. As an exercise, go ahead and add the tasks action and the chit chat action. What you have to remember is that there's already tasks and chit-chat actions in here. So you're going to need to create new task and chit-chat form actions. And don't forget to redirect to the details action when you're done posting. When we first load our details page, none of the tabs are selected. We need to actually click on one of these in order to select one of the tabs. We don't want to do that. We want a tab to be selected when we first enter the page. And we also want to take this opportunity to enable deep linking like we had with the buttons before. So if I go to details URL, then it's going to open up the details form. If I go to tasks directly, it should open up the tasks form. Same thing with chit-chat. That's what we're going to do here. By the way, did you try the previous exercise? Let's review that real quick before we get going. As you can see here, my tasks form works now. I can enter a new task. But again, when this loads up, notice that the tasks tab is not selected. So we need to select that. And chit-chat also works. I've already tested it a couple of times here. And if I tap add and go to chit-chat, there we go. There's our test. So all the tabs and the forms work. Let's quickly review what I've done on the server side to get that going. Here is the Kendo TabStrip. We have 3 tabs here. By using TabStrip add, text is set to details, tasks, and chit-chat, and then load content from loads the content dynamically from those routes. We have details form action, we have the tasks form action, and the chit-chat form action, all getting the model ID. Let's look at the controller. I'm going to roll back up to the top where we left off last time. So here we have the details form. We've already seen that in the previous lesson. Here is the tasks route. Now this route is loaded when we go directly to the tasks URL. Notice all we're returning here is the details route view, just like we would if we were to use the details route. But what's key here is that view back screen, here we're saving the details screen enum and we're using tasks here. And that way we can differentiate later in the view what screen we're actually showing. Okay, so when we load the view dynamically, this route gets called by the Kendo TabStrip. So here we're returning the partial view underscore tasks. And this is similar to how we loaded the details form. And when we save the form, we do a post action to tasks form right here. And then we redirect to the tasks action. We could redirect to details here, but since we're on tasks, we might as well redirect to the tasks action here. It gives a little bit of continuity to the user. There's an update button on the tasks. This is very similar to the way a post works. We call this one when we save each individual task on the task list. And same thing with task delete. They all perform an action on the repository and then they redirect to action tasks. And here's chit-chat. The pattern is pretty much the same for chit-chat. You can check out all this code in the completed solution when you get a chance. All right, now back to business here. How do we select the tab when the page loads? Well, let's take this one, for example, the details tab. This has a selected method on it, which takes in a Boolean. So if I set this to true, and I'm going to load the URL, chit-chat, for example, which is not even the right URL, you can see that the details form loads automatically. So how do we get the correct tab loading up when we go to the URL directly? Well, in the controller, if you remember, I have this screen that I'm setting. So if we're loading the chit-chat screen, I'm setting view bag screen to that chit-chat enum. And I'm doing that for tasks, details, and chit-chat. And that's going to give me a Boolean. So if I say here, view bag screen equals details screen enum details, this will return to us a Boolean and it'll select this tab only when the screen is details. So I'm going to copy this. Let's paste it here and change this to tasks. And finally, the chit-chat one will do the same thing and change this value to chit-chat. Let's test this out. So now I'm going directly to the chit-chat URL. And sure enough, the chit-chat tab gets loaded. If I go directly to tasks, then the tasks tab gets loaded. And one more test, details, then the details form gets loaded. Great. What happens if I navigate to chit-chat from details? Well, that works. All these tabs work, but notice the URL is not changing. So if I go to chit-chat, I want the URL to reflect that. We can accomplish this with the Kendo TabStrip by adding some attributes to the tabs. We've used HTML attributes quite a bit throughout this course already, and luckily the Telerik UI library allows us to easily extend any of the widgets with our own HTML attributes. And in this case, we're going to need to have that power as well. When we switch between the tabs in the TabStrip, the tab content is loaded dynamically. So we don't need to jump and navigate to different pages. and do a post back here. But we would like to alter the URL anyway, so we need to do this completely on the client side. And this is where a little bit of JavaScript comes in handy. I'm going to show you what we're going to do here, so you don't need to know JavaScript, but it helps. Let's head over to the code. Right after the text here, I'm going to add link HTML attributes. Link HTML attributes is for each one of the links. In other words, the tabs themselves. So these are considered links, and they have their own HTML attributes that you can change, including the on-click event. And that's what we're going to leverage here. So I'm going to provide a new collection of attributes, and I'm going to use the on-click event of the DOM. And here I want to call a JavaScript function that I'm going to create. Modern browsers have an API where you can update the URL by using the push state of the history object. So we're going to use that. I'm going to create a separate function to do that. I'm going to call it push URL. And here I want to pass in a couple of things. First, I want to pass in the new title of the page, just in case you want to change it. That's going to be RPS, project tracker. I'm going to escape the quotes inside there. And now I need to pass in the new URL. That's going to be /backlog/ and then we need to get the model ID, and then finally /details. So we're matching the existing URL structure. If you take a look at that, we have /backlog, then the ID of the item, and then /details or /tasks or /chitchat. So that's what we're doing here. I'm going to copy this. Yeah, I'm going to do the same thing over here for tasks. And then I'm also going to do the same thing for chitchat. All right, let's create this push URL function down at the bottom. Now there's one more thing I noticed that we're not doing here, and this might have gotten lost, and that's the update script. So when we update tasks, we used to load this script section right here, and we loaded a partial. This is a nice pattern for you to know because partial views cannot register scripts with the page. This is part of the way MVC works. But this is a nice little trick to be able to do that. We create a partial page just to have scripts in it, and that's this task scripts page right here, this view. All this has in it is just a script. This is our update script right here. It updates the form action to point to task update. So we're going to need that script. We don't want to lose it. I'm going to go ahead and use that. But first we need to create a section here called scripts. I'm going to use that partial first. That's just so that updates work. It's not related to our updating the URL here. Once we're done with that, we need to create a script tag and our function push URL. This is going to take in the title of the page and the new URL. So let's first check to make sure our history push state is defined in the browser. And if it's not undefined, then we can use it. So history push state. The first is the data. We don't have any data to pass in, so that's going to be null. Then the new title, and then the new URL. However, what if push state is not defined? What if it's a different browser that we're using? Then we have this other API we can use. Window, location, assign, and then we can just update the URL like that. So this function will update the URL in place. I'm going to save this, and let's take a look. There we go. I reloaded, and let's head over to chitchat. And as you can see, our URL is updated in place. So our form partial gets loaded dynamically by the TabStrip, and at the same time, we're updating the URL. If I go to tasks, that URL gets updated too. So now we can go directly to a URL and load the appropriate page, or we can switch to a different tab, and the URL will always match. There's one more very useful component that I'd like to review before we finish off this chapter, and that's the ComboBox. If we look at the final application, you can see that we're using the ComboBox here as a filtering device. So not only can we filter the chart data and the active issues by months and years, but we can also select a different assignee here, and then we can clear it out. The ComboBox also allows us to type in values here, therefore acting like search. The ComboBox is a very powerful component that comes with Kendo UI. You can take a look at the demos for basic usage, as well as server filtering and client-side filtering. We're going to be using client-side filtering, but we're going to be rendering the ComboBox on the server, just like we do with all the widgets we've been demonstrating here. And we'll also be customizing the templates. The difference between our ComboBox implementation and the dropdowns that we've been using so far is that for the ComboBox, we're going to be binding complex objects instead of just strings. Head over to your code, and in the Solution Explorer, let's open up the models, view models, and then the dashboard view model. And then in the views folder, you want to find the dashboard folder and open up the index. And let's open up the dashboard controller as well. We only have one action here, so that's going to be pretty simple. Now, our index view is actually bound to the PT dashboard VM, and we're going to need to make some alterations in the code. So I'm going to stop our server, and let's go to the PT dashboard VM. What I want to use the ComboBox for is selection of users. So our view model needs to have support for the selected assignee, and we're going to need to be able to bind to assignees. So right over here, I'm going to create a public integer, and this is going to be nullable. And the reason this is nullable is because the ComboBox allows you to clear out the value. So we want to make sure that when we post back this view model, that the integer can actually be nullable, and that's the selected assignee ID. Now we also want to have some options that are in the dropdown for the ComboBox, and that's going to be a list of users. Let's go ahead and import that from models, and I'm going to call this assignees. So our dashboard view model is going to need to take in a list of users here in the constructor and a currently selected user ID if there is one. So that's also going to be a nullable. We're going to set assignees to users, and we're going to check to see if user ID has any value. And if it does, then we'll select that value. So this is useful when we're doing postbacks and we need to reselect the user in the ComboBox. Okay, so that takes care of our view model. Now, because we've changed the view model, we're going to need to update the dashboard controller. Now, our index action already takes in a user ID that's nullable and months that's nullable. So that's already taken care of. And we're also setting the viewBag user ID to that user ID. So that's going to become important when we're doing some client-side work later on. All right, so let's get some users in here. And we need to actually get the reference to the user repository. So right up here, I'm going to have a private read-only IPT user repository right there. I'm going to call it RPS user repo. And I'm going to inject that into the constructor. And our Unity container is going to handle that injection for us automatically. That's something I reviewed at the beginning of the course. All right, so we're going to set our RPS user repo to the RPS user data parameter. And we're set. Now we have access to the user data. Here we're going to get our user's data by calling the getAll function from RPS user repo. And then we're going to pass that in to the dashboard VM along with the user ID. We also need to call toList here because we get an IEnumerable back. All right, so that takes care of the server side. I'm going to kick this off. While that's loading up, let's go open up the client side part, which is the index CS/HTML view. And right over here, I have my button group styled with Bootstrap, and this has the filter buttons. I'm going to go ahead and create another button group right before this. So I'm going to create another div here with the same classes. And this is going to have my Kendo ComboBox. So that's HTML, Kendo. And then we want to call ComboBox 4 here because we have this on the model. So we're going to use the lambda expression to point to the selected assignee ID on the model. And this is going to be multi-line. We're going to have a few properties here that we're going to fill out. So I'm going to add the paren here. All right. Now all we need to do here is bind the ComboBox to, and we're going to use the bind to operator here to give it the list that we're going to display. And that's going to be the assignees. I'm going to run this, but it's not going to give us what we want just yet. So there's the ComboBox. It has the Kendo default styling. As you can see here, we have object. So we're passing the data onto the client side, and it's being rendered here by the JavaScript libraries, the client-side libraries of Kendo UI. And that's why we're seeing object here, because it doesn't know what to display. And that's the difference that we see here from the way we were doing it with the dropdown list. Since these are complex objects, we need to specify what properties are going to be the values and what properties to display. So let's set the data value field to be ID because each of our users has an ID property, and that's going to match this selected assignee ID, which is an integer. And then the data text field is going to be the field we want to display, which is full name. When we do that, let's refresh. Now you'll see a list of names here, and these are our assignees. So if I select one, that name comes up here, and I can clear it out and select another name. Now, when this is clear, we also want to make sure that user knows what to put in there, what this is for. So let's quickly add a placeholder by using the placeholder extension. And this is just going to be a string. We're going to say select assignee. I also want this to be a little wider. So here's our friend's HTML attributes that we're going to be using again. I'm going to give it a collection of attributes. In this case, it's going to be style. And I'm just going to set the width to be 260 pixels. So just a little bit wider. Okay, let's take a look at this. There's a combo box. It's a little bit wider to select wide names, and we have select assignee as the placeholder in that input. And this works just the way it did before. But notice that we're not getting filtering. Nothing actually happens when we select anything. So we want to hook that up, and we'll do that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we want to make sure that we're going to be filtering the data in response to the combo box selection of assignees. Let's quickly take a look at the documentation first. We're going to be using events, and we've seen events before on some of the widgets we were using, but ComboBox has quite a few more available events. We're going to be using the change event in order to do a postback so we can hook into the existing filtering mechanism that we're using and update the URL accordingly. But with the Telerik UI ComboBox, you have a lot more events available to you. So you can do complete client-side data loading and filtering. And here on the demo site of the ComboBox, you can see the events section, and you can play around with the demos available here. So when you do selections, you can see what events get triggered. This is a really useful tool for you to be able to do this without having to write everything and test it out yourself. So here I selected one item. The events that are shown here in the console log is data bound, then open, selected, change, and close. This even gives you the order that you would use. If I clear this out, you can see that we have filtering event, data bound event, and then the change event. So this shows us that for clearing and for selecting, the change event is what we want to use because that's what we want to respond to when we are filtering. Let's head over to the code, and on our combo box, I'm going to add events, and this is using our friendly configuration pattern with the lambda, where I'm going to configure events. The event that I want to select is change. Now you can see all these other events that are available for you to use if you need them. So I'm going to select change, and here I'm going to provide a JavaScript function that I'm going to call. I'm going to call onAssigneeChange. Let's head down to the bottom where we have the scripts, and this is where I'm going to add my function, onAssigneeChange. So right over here in the JavaScript, I'm going to create a new function, onAssigneeChange, and this is going to take an event data as an argument. And we need to pull out the user ID that was selected. Because we've selected ID as the value, on the client side, that ID will be available as well. And we access it through the event, and then sender, and then the value. So that's going to be user ID. Now, user ID can be null because if we clear out the combo box, then the user ID will not exist. So we need to handle both of those cases. So in the case where user ID is selected, I want to redirect to a new page. So I'm going to change location, href, and I'm going to use JavaScript templated strings here. I'm going to navigate to the current page, and I'm going to use user ID as the parameter here, and I'll set that equal to the user ID that we've just parsed out. But in the case where user ID is null or undefined, I'm going to navigate, but I'm going to navigate to a different spot here. Now, I'm going to leave this blank for just a second. Let's discuss our other filtering options here. You remember earlier we talked about onFilter item click? These are our filter buttons. So right over here we have 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year. And if I click on one of these, it's going to put that parameter in the URL. So when the page reloads, we're showing the appropriate data for 6 months, and then the 6-month button is actually selected. If I set this to 12 in the URL, then this will show the 12-month period, and the 1-year button will be selected. Well, we want to do the same thing with our assignees with the user ID here. However, we don't want to lose the months. We want to keep both of those filters applied at the same time. So let's not forget that. So when user ID is null, we still want to redirect to the current page, but we want to keep the months parameter in there if it already exists. Our months parameter is actually on the view bag. Here's view bag. It's going to save our user ID and our months parameter. So we need to come up here to the server side script, And besides this user ID param, I'm going to create a months param. Let's initialize that to an empty string. And over here, if viewBag and the months property on there is not null, then my months param is going to be set to months equals, and then viewBag.months. All right, so now over here in our onAssignee_change function, we're going to redirect to the current page in case the user ID doesn't exist, but we want to also include the months parameter if it exists. So that's going to be HTML, and we're going to render this raw, so there's no URL encoding, and then months param, okay? But in case the user ID does exist, we still don't want to lose the months param. So we're going to use the user ID here, but we're also going to tack on the months parameter. So I'm going to copy this, including HTML raw helper, and I'm going to paste it right in there after the ampersand. All right, let's check this out. I'm going to reload the page, and I'm going to select one of these. Let's say Brian Upton. There we go. So when the page reloaded, this went back to the server and reloaded, we fetched the active issues considering the months equals 12 period and the user. When we returned from the post back, our selected assignee ID in the view model was ID equals 3. That's Brian Upton. And that's why the ComboBox selected that. And in the URL, we now have user ID equals 3 and months equals 12. If I go to months equals 3, notice that we're now months equals 3 in the URL, and the user ID is still the same, Brian Upton. I can switch this user to Alex Ziskind, that's me, and the user ID is 21, and months remains 3. So we're keeping the filtering going, and we're applying both parameters at the same time to our data. This is also going to be handy when we add the chart, and we're going to be reusing the exact same filter to filter the chart. All right, so we're almost done with the ComboBox. This is quite usable, but our finished application has pretty little faces of all the users and the assignees. So let's add those in using ComboBox templates. You already have some familiarity with templates because you've done this earlier in this chapter when we did dropdown templates. ComboBox templates work pretty much the same way. They use the exact same templating engine that Kendo UI for jQuery uses. So I'd like you to implement avatars here as an exercise for the ComboBox. Go ahead and try this on your own and come back when you're done. All right, let's do this together now. So if you look at the demo site and the ComboBox, you'll find customizing templates as a section here. The ComboBox allows you to provide templates for the header, the footer, and each item template. We're just going to be doing each item template here as an example. Let's head over to the code and let's scroll back up to where we have the ComboBox right here. And I'm going to use template. Now this template is for the dropdown, so this is for each item. I'm going to create a div here with the bootstrap class of row. I'm going to give it an inline style as well, just to separate avatars from the titles. I'm going to start off simple here and just add a span with the user's name. So let's give it a style. I'll give it margin left of 5 pixels. There's our span, and I'll close the div off as well. Now inside the span here, we're going to use our template syntax, and you've seen this before. I'm going to open this with #, and then data, that's going to be each item. So each assignee in our case, because we're iterating over assignees in our model. And data.fullname will give us the actual name of the user. And don't forget to close this out with the closing hash. All right, let's take a look at this. And as a result, we get pretty much what we had before. We have the names of the users, but now we're controlling the styling and the template. So we need to get the user's photos in here. And each user item has an avatar property. If we take a look at the PT user class, I'm going to hit F12 here. We have the full name, which we're already using, and we have the avatar. Now, as part of the solution code, in the content, in the images folder, you already have these avatars. These are just pictures of the users. And the avatar property that's on all these users is going to be pointing to those photos. So all we need to do is just point to the content folder here for the images. So I'm going to create an image tag with the source, and let's use a URL content helper here to map to the proper location in the content folder. It's going to be ~/content/ and then we need the avatar URL, which is going to be #data, which is our user, and then avatar, and then closing the templating syntax. And let's close off our source property here. I'm also going to give this image the bootstrap class li avatar rounded MX auto. And let me add a plus sign at the end here so we do string concatenation with the span. And there we go. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. Looks like something didn't work, and that's probably because I need to close off this div right here. I'm going to close that div. Let's try this out. And there are our users with the photos. We can select one of these and the filtering is done for us. So that's using templates in the ComboBox.